George's Marvellous Medicine by Roald Dahl, chapters 9 and 10. At that moment, George's mother came back from shopping in the village. She drove her car into the yard and got out. She was carrying a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop. And when she looked up and saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, she dropped the bag of groceries. "How about that then, Mary?" Grandma shouted. "I'll bet you've never seen a hen as big as that. That's George's giant hen, that is." But, stammered George's mother. "It's George's magic medicine," Grandma shouted. "We've both of us have had it, the hen and I." "But how in the world did you get up on the roof?" cried the mother. "I didn't," cackled the old woman. "My feet are still standing on the floor in the living room." This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped. She looked as though she was going to faint. A second later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Killiecrankie. Mr. Cranky was a small man with bandy legs and a huge head. He was a kind father to George, but he was not an easy person to live with, because even the smallest things got him worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing, and when Mr. Cranky saw it, he started jumping about as though something was burning his feet. "Great heavens!" he cried, waving his arms. "What's this? What's happened? Where did it come from? It's a giant hen! Who did it?" "I did," George said. "Look at me!" Grandma shouted from the rooftop. "Never mind the hen. What about me?" Mr. Cranky looked up and saw Grandma. "Shut up, Grandma!" he said. It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up through the roof of the house. It was the hen that excited him. He had never seen anything like it. But then, who had? "Ah, it's fantastic!" Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing around and round. "It's colossal! It's gigantic! It's tremendous! It's a miracle! How did you do it, George?" George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, the big hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went cluck, 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 cluck. Everyone stared at it. When it stood up again, there was a brown egg lying there. The egg was the size of a football. "That egg would make scrambled eggs for 20 people. "George," Mr. Cranky shouted, "how much of this medicine have you got?" "I've got lots," George said. "There's a big saucepan full in the kitchen, and this bottle here is nearly full." "Come with me," Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm. "Bring the medicine. For years and years I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton." They went to the pigsty first. George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig. The pig blew smoke from its nose and jumped about all over the place. Then it grew and grew. In the end, it looked like this. They went to the herd of fine bullocks that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them some medicine, and this is what happened. Then the sheep. He gave some to his grey pony, Jack Frost. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. Chapter 10. A crane for Grandma. Grandma, from high up on the rooftop, could see everything that was going on and didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running round and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mr. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. "Hey you!" she yelled. "George, get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast." "Don't listen to the old goat," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck where she is, and a good thing too." "But we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy! You disgusting little worm! Fetch me a cup of tea at once, and a slice of currant cake." "We'll have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us any peace if we don't." Mr. Cranky came outside, and she agreed with George. "She's my mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof like that for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send their biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels, and there were 2 men inside. The crane men climbed up on the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped on his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm on a gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "Out of my way! Clear the decks! Stand back, all you miserable midgets! I'll trample you to death!" and other silly things like that. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. Chapter 11. Mr. Cranky's Great Idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making it at once. More and more and more." The giant saucepan had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Killicranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons." Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build Marvellous Medicine Factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We will become rich and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put the butter in his coffee and the milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." Why won't they?" George asked. "Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "The heck with my cornflakes!" cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. "Come on, George, let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is make one saucepan full as a tester." "But, Dad," said little George, "the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "How can there possibly be any trouble? You've only got to put the same stuff in a saucepan as you did yesterday, and while you're doing it, I'll write down all the stuff in every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe." "But, Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. "And then," he cried, "when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on the old hen just to make absolutely sure we've got it right. And after that, we'll all shout hooray and build the giant factory." "But, Dad—" "Come on then. What is it you want to say?" "I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put in the saucepan to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end, and you see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in?" "I went up to the bathroom first," George said. "I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table." "Come on then," cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "Up we go to the bathroom." When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosols and empty bottles. "That's great," said Mr. Cranky. "That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, it means you used it." So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. "A box of powder," said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. "Helga's hair set. Flowers of turnips perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next?" "To the laundry room," George said. "But are you sure you haven't missed anything up here, Dad?" "That's up to you, my boy," Mr. Cranky said. "Have I?" "I don't think so," George said. So down he went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. "My goodness me! What a mass of stuff you used!" he cried. "No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot?" "No, Dad, it's not," George said, and he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the big 5 empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all the names. "Anything else?" Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Killiecranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on his list. He then went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used.